Today, see how Tanium Zero Trust enhances Microsoft Entra ID Conditional Access. Welcome back to Tanium Tech Talks. I'm your host, Ashley McGlone. Zero trust is a popular consideration in both the worlds of security and ops teams these days. And Tanium has a large selection of Microsoft integrations where our speed and data really elevate these experiences. Entra ID Conditional Access is a perfect match for Tanium's Zero Trust solution. Ultimately, users who are denied access due to an unhealthy endpoint state can not only be identified, but also remediated quickly with Tanium. And this means that those users get back to productivity faster. So we're going to do a full walkthrough today. And our expert's no stranger to the show. His episodes on deploying Microsoft MDE and imaging new endpoints with Tanium Provision were in the top 10 leaderboard for 2024 because you voted with your clicks and your watch time. So thank you for making Rob a celebrity here on the Tanium channel. So Rob's back with us again today. Rob, tell us a little bit about yourself for those who haven't met you yet.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, my name's Rob. I am Tanium TAM based out of the UK. I've been with Tanium about 3.5 years now. Prior to Tanium, my career's had me both on the customer side and with various partners, predominantly following Microsoft. So when I came to Tanium and saw what we were up to, it was a really good fit.
Well, it was really good to see you again in person at Converge. Wink, wink. There's a Converge commercial in the middle of the year. Yep, we got to talk about Converge, but it was really good to see you again in person and to see you here again today. And I know we even had some labs around this at Converge. So I wanted to come back to this topic because I know it's significant for a lot of people. So for just to get us started, could you tell us what is the problem we're solving?
To give you some background, if you're not familiar with it, Entra ID Conditional Access is allowing you to effectively put a firewall around your applications and then determine who can access them based on who they are, where they are. So geolocation comes into this, what type of authentication you want them to complete. So do you want MFA? And then the posture of the device itself. And that's where Tanium comes in. So there is some native capability from Microsoft on this. But what we have with Tanium really takes that to the next level. All the flexibility and the granularity that you expect and you have with Tanium and the speed. And that's what really sets us apart from the out-of-the-box offerings.
I want to drill down on something you just said. You said protecting applications. I guess in my mind, I was thinking of more like network access control, but this is a little different. Could you kind of elaborate on the difference between network access control and application protection?
Sure. So if you're an Entra ID customer, as I'm sure lots of people watching this will be, think of this when you go to My Apps. So you go to myapps.microsoft.com, you authenticate, you log in, and you get all your tiles with all the different services that you can access. And it's those individual applications that we're able to put granular controls around, so we can say, based on your device's posture, you can access this, but you can't access that. Whereas network access control is typically the ability to control access to a physical network port or maybe a Wi-Fi network and then drive what VLAN you perhaps end up on then. Now, it's not something that we're going to go into today, but you can also use exactly this same data to drive NAC if you want to. Because if you think about it, Entra ID is just a directory. So in the same way that we've been working with Active Directory for years with Microsoft, next evolution of that is Entra ID. And what we are doing, and we'll go into this and show you what it does and how it works, is we're writing data to that directory, and then we're building conditional access rules around that data. There's nothing stopping you using exactly that same direct data in the directory with other products that are on the market. If they can consume it, you can use that to drive, what VLAN a device ends up on. So if it's unhealthy, maybe you drop it into a remediation network, that kind of thing.
I'm tracking with you now because as soon as you say my apps, I know for us, for a lot of people in the world, that's a daily experience. So that helps me there. So how does the Tanium? I guess before we get into how it works, what did we build exactly for the Tanium Zero Trust integration here?
So it's actually remarkably simple. And this was something when I first joined Tanium, I said we should do this. And I was new and shouty and a Brit, and that's what we do. Um, and I don't think anybody actually listened to me because brighter people than me decided to do it. But if you think about Team's core strength, which is get anything back from lots of devices very quickly and have a low endpoint impact, that's what we're leveraging. So the example we're going to use today is looking at whether a Defender has updated or not recently. Really simple example, but it's any sensor or combination of sensors from within Tanium. And that could be out of the box ones that we provide. That can be ones that you've written, so they can be tailored to your devices and your line of business. And we're able to take that data and say, well, it's got to meet these conditions. And depending on what conditions you configure, we then go and write one or more attributes on the computer object associated with that test in Entra ID. And that's all we're doing. What we then do, and this is an optional piece, and we'll show you it today, is using some of the other Tanium capabilities to address some of the other out-of-the-box limitations that exist. So in my previous role, I looked after an infrastructure team on the customer side. We weren't a Tanium customer, unfortunately. But we used conditional access. And the use case we had there was saying, right, we're migrating data to SharePoint Online and OneDrive, that kind of thing, as lots of customers and organizations are. We wouldn't allow you to bring your personal laptop into our offices, plug it into the wall, and browse the file server. Yeah, we've got controls in place, both technology and rules that say you must not do that. So you couldn't do it. But we wouldn't allow you to do that from home as well. So just because the data is now in the cloud doesn't mean you can go and access it from your personal device. And we used conditional access policies to drive that. Now and again, for various reasons, a device would go non-compliant. Sometimes we saw it after patching, for example. We were using BitLocker on devices. BitLocker would get suspended for the patch application. Now and again, it wouldn't get resumed correctly, and you'd end up with a device with BitLocker that was suspended that then caused the conditional access policy to fail. So from a security perspective, that's good. However, our users didn't know that they got a problem until they tried to access something, and they just got an unhelpful denied type error, which drove service desk calls. And the time, and this is something that you were talking about at the beginning, the time taken to get them back up and running was quite long. It could be several hours. So you could really have a really detrimental impact on somebody's day. A lot of this was happening during COVID when we're obviously really reliant on remote working and this new ways of doing things. So it made life pretty hard. So one of the things that we can do with Tanium is use our digital employee experience capabilities to alert people proactively that they have a problem and help them fix it. So it could be that we can fix it silently and we don't need to talk to them at all. We might proactively tell them that they might have seen a disruption, or it could have been in the example I just gave, where we need to reboot their device to fix BitLocker. So we can say, you've got a problem, you're not going to be able to access your services until you fix this. Can we do it now? We need to reboot. It's going to take a couple of minutes. Great. And then once that's done, the speed element of Tanium really comes in again. The native tooling can take several hours to update. Tanium, we're talking minutes. And it really is that quick, which is fantastic. So we alert the user they've got a problem, we fix it with them quickly, proactively, reboot the device, whatever's required. And again, this is just using packages. So anything within Tanium that you can do, we can bring in as part of this solution. And then as they get them back up and running again, you can go even further if you want to with decks and bring things like ServiceNow tickets and so on into it. Again, we won't go into that today. It's a bit advanced for a quick call, but you can really take this in any way you choose.
And it reminds me, sometimes my internet provider will send me an email or a text and it says, "Hey, we've detected an outage in your area." Kind of like proactively, right, going out
Yeah,
and finding problems and then trying to fix them before they're an impact,
absolutely.
or minimize the impact, right? So this has been available for a while. What are we hearing from customers? You've described a lot of the benefits. I'm curious what we're hearing from other customers in the field.
But there's somebody I've been talking to recently over in Europe. they have been looking at the native capabilities, and the native capabilities really revolve around the notion that a device is compliant or it is not compliant, and that is from a device standpoint. So your device either passes a set of criteria or it doesn't, and then you can use that to control whether you allow access to applications or not. You can't have different degrees of compliance. It either is or it isn't. It's a binary. Now with Tanium, you can have multiple checks, you can stack them up, and depending on what the results are, you can put different data into Entra ID. Now, the reason this is interesting to this account is because they have got different degrees of applications. So they are saying, right, well, to access my top tier stuff, you've got to meet all of these conditions. And if you do, wonderful, you're in. If you don't meet them all, you're still able to access this tier of service, and so on and so forth. And that moves, I say, beyond simply a yes or a no. So that's a really nice use case. And it is, like I say, you combine that with things like DEX, where we're working with the end user. It's a really different approach. We've had other people that want to evaluate their devices based on their line of business, which again, you have some ability to do that natively with Intune, but it's what Microsoft provide you. So is the device BitLocker encrypted? Does it have an antivirus product that Security Center understands, that kind of thing? You think about what you can do with us, where one of the examples we're going to do today is, are my antivirus definitions no more than 2 days old? So it's that level of control and granularity that you get with sensors that we're bringing in, and they really like that. Combined with the speed approach, I say my last role, where we were seeing quite extended delays to get devices actually recognized as being healthy again, despite the fact they were. That's very different. We're talking a few minutes rather than several hours.
As shows go, we've been talking a long time. This is fantastic setup. I mean, you've got me sold. So I want to see it now, and I know a lot of our viewers are really eager to see what does this look like. You said it's simple,
Yep.
so I'm really eager for you to take us through. Show us how to do this.
Cool. Okay, so we'll work through it. I guess just some prerequisites to cover first. So from the Tanium side, you need the Tanium core product, obviously, and you need the Enforce module, which is what brings Zero Trust. On the Microsoft side, you need your devices enrolled within Intune. So that means they've got to be Windows 10, Windows 11, Mac, or one of the Linux supported distributions. So that is a little bit narrower than what Tanium supports, but because we leverage Entra ID as part of this, you've got to be compatible with both. And you've got to have the appropriate licensing. I am not a Microsoft licensing expert, so we'll park that there. But you need Intune.
Yeah, I don't know anybody in the world that's a Microsoft licensing expert. I mean, when you and I both used to work at Microsoft, and they had a whole teams of people who were trying to figure out licensing internally. So, yeah, we could give them a little elbow, a little rub there. Yeah.
Yeah, I learned a long time ago to avoid those conversations. How do we set this up? As I've explained, we're looking at sensors to get data back. So what do we want to test for? And in this case, I'm going to use the Microsoft Defender antivirus status sensor. We'll have a quick look at what that looks like in a minute. We need an extension attribute in Entra ID to write to. So if you're not familiar with Entra ID, but you've worked with, say, Active Directory before, it's exactly the same concept as extension attributes there. These are just buckets that you, as a customer, can write data in and do stuff with. Obviously, you want to be careful that you're not conflicting with something else. Again, we go back to on-prem AD days. We'll have seen that over and over again, I'm sure. That's literally all it is. We need permissions for Tanium to be able to connect to Entra ID and write that data, and we'll walk through connecting that in a minute. Once we've done that, we go into Zero Trust within Tanium, configure it, tell it what we're interested in looking for, and then we can set up the connection. So I'm just going to show you the setup. So this is a really small cloud environment that I've got here, and I'm going to use the Defender antivirus details sensor. I've got 2 Windows 11 devices in this lab, one of which, Win 11 Cube 1, you can see MDE looks pretty healthy. It's enabled. It last updated within 24 hours, and we got a signature version. You can see my other Windows 11 device is not healthy. It last updated a very long time ago, apparently. It's broken. So the scenario here is we want to make sure that Defender is actually working properly and it's healthy, and we're going to use this data. But we could use anything we wanted. It really depends what is appropriate for your organization. So if I go into shared services and Zero Trust. The first thing we need to do is configure the settings. So we've got this message across the top telling us. So to start with, we need our tenant ID, an application registration, and a certificate or a secret. So if we go to our help.tanium.com guide and you go into Zero Trust, this walks you through it. We need to go to the configuring section. And if we scroll down, this talks about configuring the app registration within Azure. And this is just effectively a service account. It's a way of us authenticating to the cloud service to be able to update these attributes. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into my Azure tenant, go into app registrations. I'm going to create a new one, and we'll call this Tanium Zero Trust. The defaults are fine at this point. So again, if you've got a more complicated environment where you've got multiple tenants, you might need to consider this a little bit more. But for the art of what we're doing here, this is absolutely fine with a standard single tenant. So we create it. And at this point, we've got things like our application ID and our directory ID that we're going to need later. The next thing I need to do is grant permissions to this account. So if we go into API permissions, add a permission, and then this is a graph permission, and then application permissions. And if I go back to our instructions, we're interested in the device.readwrite.all permission. So if we come back here, we can search for that, expand device, we can see that there. Add permissions. And then you'll see down here that we have to consent for this permission to be granted. I'm in as a tenant admin. If I was in a more delegated RBAC model, this might be where somebody that's got more permissions than I do actually says, yes, you can have that level of permission. But for me, it's as simple as saying yes, and off we go. So we can see green ticks here. That means we're good from an Azure perspective. The next thing we need to do is create our secret. So this is effectively the password that would be associated. So we're going to create a new one. I'm going to make this reasonably short. You would probably create this for a longer one. You're probably, if you're an Entra ID or an Azure user, so you're probably familiar with this. So you'd want to monitor this and rotate it before it expires. So we'll create one, and we can see identities here. Now, what we're interested in is the value. You can only see a little bit of it on the screen. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to go back to Zero Trust. So let's delete what the browser has tried to put in. The client secret we paste in there. And then if we come back here and go to overview, we need the application ID, which we paste into this box. And we need our directory ID, which we paste into this box. Then we hit save and we confirm that. And we can see it's updated. That red bar has now gone away, which is good. So at this point, we've created our permissions in Azure. We've created the configuration within Tanium. We're good. They'll link together.
So, I just got to say, I'm interrupting you because
go for it.
Usually, we've been in IT a long time, you and I, and you go to the help article, and that help article has a breadcrumb trail to another help article. Oh wait, you got to have this configured, and it's like you end up 5 layers deep in docs somewhere. But I just have to say, as an IT admin, to see this work with just a couple steps straight out of the docs, chef's kiss. That's amazing.
Yeah, and that's the point of doing this video, isn't it? We want to make this really easy for people to consume. We haven't said it. There's a community article that we're in the midst of publishing as well that is walking you through exactly these steps. So if you don't want to listen to me, you want to read some words, you can do that too. The next thing we need to do is define our rules. So remember, I was using the Microsoft Defender antivirus sensor that's multi-column, so it's bringing back different bits of data. And what we're interested in is highlighting healthy devices. And if you think about the rules, and we'll go into a little bit more detail of this when we're in Entra ID, I like comparing this to firewall rules. So if you think about your traditional firewall rule set, it ends with a denial. So unless something has been actually allowed, you're denying it. And that is the way I would suggest that people do this. Obviously, every organization is different. Everybody has their own needs and requirements. But if you go with the approach that unless I proactively say something is good, then it's bad, the worst that happens is you block somebody out when you didn't intend to. Whereas if you go the other way around and say, well, I'll tell you when something isn't right and I'll react to that, you get, it's a little bit like, we don't like negative targeting in Tanium, because if something goes wrong, you can accidentally misclassify something in one way or another and you don't get a desired outcome. So what we're going to do here is proactively check for something being healthy. If it is healthy, we're going to tell Entra ID it's healthy, and we're going to configure our rule within conditional access that says unless the device is recorded as healthy, deny it. So that's kind of the road that we're going to go down. So we'll walk through doing that now. So we hit create rule and we'll give it a name. So let's call it MDE health. And we're going to set it to enforcement. We won't go into lots of detail today, but in both Tanium Zero Trust and in conditional access rules, you have the ability to run in either an enforcement or an auditing type mode. Just be careful with this. I've known people to lock themselves out of their tenants. So when we go into the conditional access rules, you define what it is and who it is you're applying this to. So if you apply it to everybody and everything, and you get it wrong in some way, then you might not be able to get into your tenant, and that results in a call to Microsoft, which is all a bit tedious.
That's called testing in production.
Yep. We've all learned better than to do that by now.
Yep.
So, because we are going to take this data in Entra ID and build another rule around it, I'm happy to go and stick this in enforcement now. And this is also a test tenant. It doesn't worry me, but in production, just be careful and test before you turn it on. So we're going to put it in enforcement mode. And then the meat of this is the targeting. And if you're familiar with deploy or patch or deploying a package, this will be very familiar. What we're saying is find me stuff that looks like this, and that's what I'm interested in. So I'm going to press add targeting, press add row, and then I'm going to look for my sensor. So I'm going to look for Microsoft Defender antivirus details. So all the usual filters are here. You can do row filters if you're into regexes, that kind of thing. You don't need to, because there's an option to add and do groups with this. So I don't particularly enjoy writing regexes. I'm not sure many people do. But you can get really complex with this without needing to resort to that. So what we're interested in is the signature date age. And I'm just going to use is less than, I'm going to say 2. So in this case, it was 0 or 1. So 0 was within the last 24 hours, 1 was 24 to 48. Whatever works for you. And in this case, I'm just going to press add, get rid of that. What you will also see is that the wizard has automatically added in this piece here, which is talking about my tenant ID. So when a device is enrolled in Entra ID, so this could be Windows, Mac, or Linux, obviously they store the information in different places, there is a tenant ID stamped on that device locally. And in the background, there is a sensor that goes and runs to identify devices that are actually enrolled. So the point here is that we won't try and write data back for devices that aren't enrolled in Entra ID. Doesn't make any sense. We're just going to cause a whole load of mess and a load of noise in your logs within the Azure tenant. So if you see that, that's why, and it's meant to be there. Endpoint last seen. So this is in hours, and this is worth considering. So if you think about my scenario here, where I'm saying for a device to be healthy, it's got to have updated its signatures for MDE within the last 2 days. What happens if that device is offline and it's turned off, Tanium isn't seeing it? Or maybe somebody's broken Tanium that's malicious, perhaps. We need to factor in when did we last see that device as part of our calculations. Now, 720 hours is possibly a bit long. Equally, you need to think about like long weekends where you've got public holidays and so on. So you probably want at least 2 to 3 days, I would suggest. But that's what this is about. Again, just think about your environment and what works for you. We'll leave that as it is. We don't need to go into that today, but that's what that is about. And then the final piece is looking at the attribute. So you can add or remove an attribute. This option down the bottom should probably be a default, being honest. What this is saying is once I've set this according to the criteria here, if the device falls out of those criteria, undo it. So in this case, I'm saying if the definitions are updated within the last 2 days, go and set this. If they haven't, remove it. So in this case, all I need to do is I said I'm going to use extension attribute 1. We've got 1 through 15 available. And I'm going to put this in there. So we'll just say MDE healthy. And that's it. So if I hit save, we will see, we'll just check this quickly. So we've got our name, we're enforcing it. We've got our targeting. If I want to, I can press preview. So we can see here, we've got a couple of devices in this environment, but critically, the one we're interested in is Win11 Cube 1. If you remember, Win11 Cube 2 was the device with the broken Defender. So we hit save, and we can see that's created our rule. Pretty straightforward. We expand this, we see the targeting, so on and so forth. If I go into the audit log, this will start showing the updates in a few minutes. And that's it from the Tanium side for the basic configuration. Obviously, we haven't talked about decks or anything else at this point, but to actually put the rule in and have it writing something into Entra ID, that's all you need to do.
So help me understand what's going on here. We've
Yep.
to summarize real quick, we've gotten Azure plumbed in, so we're connected and talking to Entra ID. Tanium now has this rule. So this is a shared service called Zero Trust in Tanium. That
Yep.
service means it's got some data and it's doing something with that data. So now that we've created the rule, what happens behind the scenes here?
Funny you should ask that. Should we go and have a look? I've come into the Entra Admin Center. So if you're familiar with Entra ID at all, you'll know this is where your various devices are registered. We've got some Windows, Linux, Android, and so on in here. And we've got our 2 Windows 11 devices. So if I come in to my device here, it hasn't quite updated yet. But if we come into these devices, this is where we will see that extension attribute being written. So we've got Cube 1 and Cube 2. We just need to give this a few minutes out. There we go.
That was fast. I mean, we're
Yep.
recording this in real time, and that was maybe 60 seconds.
Probably not even that. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's what you will see. So at this point, I can immediately see that. Now, the next logical step is to go onto the conditional access rule and configure it, and we'll do that next. But even from a reporting perspective, and this is something I was helping a customer with that's got lots of different divisions, and they were wanting to progress with conditional access. And what this exposed was that they'd got devices that hadn't been Intune enrolled, but they thought had, because we weren't sending the rules, the data there. And there was also a division that was a bit untruthful about its Tanium deployment as well, and it highlighted that as well. So it's quite a useful reporting data point as well, and it's bringing Tanium data into another platform, which is always useful.
So that really is a better together story. You're using it to kind of audit that both
Yeah.
Tanium and Microsoft and Intune and Entra are all properly configured to fully cover the environment. And if there's a gap on either side, this will make it very apparent.
Exactly that. Yeah, it was really powerful. I mean, it was slightly frustrating from my perspective because I wanted to get them finished. But it was really good from their perspective because it made it very clear what was done and what wasn't done, which was really powerful. If we just go back, make sure that Cube 2 still shows no extension attribute. That's good. That's what we expect. That's our device that's not in a good state. As we're in this console, this is where we now need to do the conditional access work. So just to show you where it is, you want to expand protection if it's not already expanded, and then go into conditional access. If you're not familiar with this, this is where you would typically be configuring things like mandatory MFA, which I hope every customer on the planet is now. But this is also where you can configure things like geo-blocking and so on as well. So, this depends what licensing you have with Microsoft. But one of the things we found really useful in my last role was the ability to block based on country. So there were lots of bits of the world that we did not do business in, we did not allow our staff to go there with work devices. You can kind of imagine the sorts of places I'm describing. And we certainly had no interest in people logging in from there, even if they did take a mobile phone on holiday or something. So the ability to say you cannot log into anything from these countries was really powerful, because when you went and looked at the audit logs, that showed that such a large percentage of the bad actor attempts to get into our single sign-on services was coming from those countries. Um, uh, we all know there is no one answer to these types of security problems, and it's a defense in depth approach. And the more things that you have, so the MFA, looking at locations, looking at device posture, the better. We're in conditional access, and we go into policies. And so this is an out-of-the-box standard Microsoft tenant. I would imagine, will see these Microsoft managed policies there. What they are really about is controlling how you authenticate. So top one is turning off legacy auth. So that's forcing you to use the modern style authentication, and it's requiring multi-factor authentication. That's fine. We're not going to touch those. We'll leave those alone. So what we're going to do is create a new policy, and we can call this Tanium Zero Trust. And as I said earlier, you want to be kind of cautious when you set this up. So I've got a test user that is licensed that I'm going to use, and they're called Entra user. Very imaginative when I created this. So to start with, we're saying, who does this apply to? Now, the way you eventually want to get to is all users, probably with some named exclusions. There's, you know how it is, that life isn't perfect. There are often things you have to exclude from MFA for app integration, whatever. But you want to get to the point where you're saying everybody apart from these named things. And I understand what those are. So you have a little bit like the policy approach, where you say, unless I say something else, I have the strongest level of controls applying. So next piece is target resources. So this is the what am I protecting? So we've already said who does this apply to. And in this case, I'm just going to pick Office 365, which is things like Exchange Online, it's SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, etc. So your standard Office applications. But this can be any single sign-on application you've registered with Entra ID. That could be Tanium. That could be other third-party stuff. So again, this is really powerful. And what the golden line is all resources, and calling out things that you specifically don't want this to apply to. We're not going into loads of detail, but kind of the approach that I would take. Network. So this is looking at IP addressing or countries, that kind of thing. So when I was saying the GRIP stuff, this is where you would configure that. We don't care in this case because we're going to apply the policy regardless. But one option might be perhaps you have a different level of authentication requirements for your VDI environment versus people that are working from home, that kind of thing. So that's where you might use that. What we do need to configure are conditions. So you can do everything from looking at device health. So that would be an Intune configuration compliance policy. We can look at the type of application that's being used. So for instance, you might allow access to mailboxes using the Outlook app on mobile phones, but not with anything else. So that would be how you configure this. But what we're interested in is filter for devices. So we click this, say yes. And this is where this might seem a bit peculiar, but I'll explain why, and hopefully it'll become clear. So what we're going to do is say yes, configure it. I'm going to exclude devices from this policy based on this. So the property is going to be extension attribute 1, and it's going to be equals. And if I go back here, attribute we named MDE healthy, paste that in, and then hit done. And if I go back in there, you can see that's taken that. That seems odd because I've just excluded devices that I've written the attribute to from the policy. And the reason I've done that is when I go into grant, I'm going to say block access. And I'm not going to tick any of the others. This is where I might require MFA or a particular type of device. So device compliance would kick in here, for example, that kind of thing.
Well,
And
this
that's going
is
to save
just
a lot of.
completely in the tradition of Microsoft Group policy where it's not disabled, right? They put the double negative stuff in there to
Yeah,
really make you stop and think if you got to think through it. So this is very clear that's helpful.
yeah, and that's why. So what we're saying is, if my Entra user wants to access Office 365, we're denying them unless they are coming from a device that's got that attribute set. It's a bit counterintuitive, but that's how it works. And it works fine because it's a very clear, specific control. And then finally, while we're here, session controls limiting how long you're logged in for before you get challenged for authentication again. We don't care about that for this. We're just interested in using that attribute to control access. Finally, down the bottom here, we've got policy. So off, on, or report only. So report only is really helpful. We won't use that now. We're going to turn it on. But report only allows you to create a policy and then do a what if effectively. So if you've ever done PowerShell and use the what if argument, you can then look at authentication logs and say, right, well, these are the policies that did apply. And then there's an additional tab that will show you, well, this is what would have happened using this other policy. So again, it allows you to implement changes in a controlled manner. And as you grow the policy or change its scope, you can test it and see what would happen before you do it and cause some unintended chaos or lock people out or so on and so forth. That's our policy created. That will take a couple of minutes to kick in. So what I'm going to suggest we do is go back to Tanium while we let Entra ID do its thing. We'll talk about DEX quickly and what we can do there as from the other side of this. And then we can go and have a look on my test devices and see what the user experience is. I'm going to go back to Tanium and I'm going to go into Engage. So if you're not familiar with it, this is part of our digital employee experience capability. The initial intention for DEX was really looking at what's happening on an endpoint. So if you think about performance and all the data we get there, take that data and then work with the operator of the machine to say, have you got a problem? Can I help you fix it? Through to sentiment type surveys, all sorts of things, notifying people that there's a fire alarm in another building. Sounds a bizarre thing, but say where I used to work, we had 50 odd sites. So actually letting the wider business know that actually you're not going to be able to get hold of the person in that site for the next half an hour because they're stood outside in the car park would have been quite useful. And what we're leveraging here is the ability to notify operators of the device based on exactly the same criteria as Zero Trust does, and then coming up with a fix if it's appropriate. So again, this is not a DEX walkthrough. There's people that are far better with it than I am that I know there are videos on, so we'll just do what we're going to do with it today. So what we need is a fix. So we call that a remediation. So that's the thing we're going to run, and then we'll create a survey and apply it. So I'm going to go into remediations, and you'll see out the box there's a whole stack of them here. So things like fixing browsers, common applications, rebooting the device. But we'll create a new one, and we're going to call this Remediate MDE. We're Windows focused for this, but again, at this point, this is any package that exists within Tanium. So I have my update Microsoft Defender package that just triggers an update. Hit save, and then hit submit. So at this point, I've created a remediation, so I can then call that from my survey. So if we go and create a survey, you can create templates, you can have themes around this, so you can put like your own branding, your own logo, that kind of thing. So you give your employees confidence that it's real and it's not like a browser pop-up, that kind of thing. But keep it simple, we'll avoid all that today. So our survey title is going to be access to Office is restricted. We've got language options. We'll stick with English because my Spanish isn't very good, much to my wife's frustration. So if we go into our conditions, and we'll keep this really simple. So we're going to use just that Microsoft Defender antivirus detail sensor again. So sensor data age is sorry, I get this the right way around, is greater than 1. So the reason I've done this, if you think about the zero trust rule, we were looking for positive confirmation the device was healthy. So we're saying it had to be less than 2. In this scenario, we're looking for devices that are unhealthy. So it's the exact opposite of that. So there's probably many ways of doing this, but the approach I take is saying, right, well, if it was less than 2, it's got to be greater than 1 in this scenario. So really straightforward. So apply that, hit save. And what you'll see, very much like the zero trust workflow that we looked at, there's a quick preview that will fly out here. So we can click that, and this will show us the devices that match that criteria now. So one device meets it. Wonderful. How often do we want to notify people? Clearly, you don't want to be spamming your employees, but this is pretty important. So you might want to notify them hourly they've got a problem. We should be proactive about fixing these types of things. So that's how often we're going to do that. There is a back off with this. If you've got multiple surveys going, we can't become a real nuisance and spam the user effectively. It will back off, and that's covered in documentation. So survey questions. Again, we could have existing ones that are created. We're just going to create a new one. So we'll call this E8 virus. And then in this case, we just need a single option, and it's going to be yes. Now, we could just do this with a scheduled action, or with enforce, or with deploy, lots of other ways of doing this, just an example. But if you think about the BitLocker example I gave earlier, where we need to unsuspend BitLocker and reboot the device, this is where you would want to throw a prompt up. So the remediation, we've got a few different options. We could throw a link to a web page, for example. We're going to run a task. And that was that task that we created earlier. So if I come here and select Remediate MDE, again, I haven't created one for Mac platforms, so it's only Windows for this, but the option is there if you want it. And this will give us a preview of what it's going to look like. So pretty straightforward. We can save this as a template if we need to, but what we care about is just creating a survey at this point. We've created it. We could do our language support if we need to. No need to do any of that. So we can quickly check it. We've given it a title. What are we looking for? How often are we going to check? What are we going to ask? And what are we going to do about it? And then if we hit save and schedule run, one thing to call out here, and again, if you're a patch or a deploy customer, or you've set up scheduled actions, that kind of thing, this will be familiar. How often are we going to do this? Now, we want this to start and just run until we tell it to stop running. So we're going to select ongoing. We don't care about time zones in this case because it's going to start now. Keep it simple. And then computer groups. So in this case, we'll go for Windows. Again, you do what's appropriate for your environment. So we can see here, we're targeting a total of 4 endpoints. There are 4 Windows endpoints in this environment. We can immediately see that there's one endpoint that this is going to apply to. And then there's a couple of options here. Do we want them to allow a postponement on this? Well, no, I don't, because I want my antivirus fixed. But again, depending on what the issue is, how aggressive you want to be, you've got those different options. Do you want them to decline it? Probably not appropriate here, but this is if you're thinking about like sentiment, happiness type surveys, you might use that. Do we want to anonymize the data? Again, we don't really care about that for this. So at this point, we'll hit run survey. That's deployed now. That will now go out to our devices. So if I go to my 2 Windows 11 machines, so hopefully you can see this on the video. This is Cube 1. So this was the device that was healthy. So what we'll do is open up the web browser and go to Outlook, which is part of Office 365. And we can log in. We were good. We were healthy. Go to our second device, Outlook as well. We've been denied. So if you've ever used conditional access policies before, this is what you will see. And we can see various details about why it failed here. Now, what will happen in a couple of minutes, we'll get a prompt in the lower right-hand corner from Dex telling us that we've got a problem. So if you imagine we hadn't just set all this up in the last 45 minutes or so, my device had become unhealthy, I would be seeing the prompt far quicker than I would be getting the deny from trying to go in. Again, this is far quicker than you would get with the native Microsoft stack. If you look at what we've just set up, bang, you're in, and it's the same user. It's just looking at the health and the posture of that device. We'll give that a couple of minutes to kick in with DEX. If I come back to Entra ID quickly, go into our Entra user, go into sign-in logs. What you'll see here is, this will take a couple of minutes to catch up. If we come in here, this is where we'll start to see the logins. And then if we go into conditional access, you'll start to see which policies applied to it. So exactly the same as if you're using native compliance policies within Intune, because it's still just conditional access. We're just using it a different way.
Yeah, just to call out that point you just made about we're walking through setup from scratch, but once this is up and running, I mean, just thinking about this is where really the Tanium speed comes in. I'm just trying to think, what did people do without Tanium for this? I mean, users would sit there not knowing why their machine's not able to access it, and nobody to tell them. Then they have to call a help desk and open a ticket. But here, literally within seconds, Tanium's going to pop a dialogue to them, say, "Oh, are you having an access issue?" Kind of like Clippy, right? Are you having an access issue? Would you like us to fix that for you?
We need an Annie GIF there, don't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was exactly what I experienced on the customer side. It was great from a security standpoint. It was a really effective control, but it did cause quite a few service desk calls. And as I say, we looked at it, and it was standard stuff that kept happening. It was the BitLocker issue after Patch Tuesday. It was probably like the high 90% of the issues. Because, I mean, you and I are technical, we can look at that and have a reasonable understanding of what it means. But, if you're not in IT, that isn't particularly helpful, and you can't tailor it as the customer either. You get what you're given. Once you get the DEX notification, which would come up way before you were actually told there was a problem, it's a vastly better experience. Okay, so we've got our notification prompt. So if you've used patch, deploy, those types of modules within Tanium, you'll be familiar with this, but this is what DEX uses as well. So we've got our prompt. It's saying access to Office is restricted, and it's telling us to open the portal. So we'll press that button. And this is bringing up the self-service portal. So again, if you're a patch or a deploy customer, you'll almost certainly be familiar with this. If you're not, you can use this to drive access to software updates, that kind of thing, automatically. And we also leverage this for DEX. So in this case, it's brought me straight into the surveys tab, and I can see I've got a notification. I've got one here waiting. Clearly, this is branded as Tanium because we are Tanium. But I could put my own logos, my own wording in here as well. There's all sorts of controls around icons and sticking on the desktop, that kind of thing. But we can see here the question that we asked. So we've got a problem with MDE. Can we update it? Really simple. We just hit yes and submit, and that's done. And in the background, that will launch that action for us automatically. So I don't need to elevate. All the usual advantages that we get with packages and running with Tanium apply here. So we've given the user the option to run it. So the example I've gone back to a few times in my previous role where we had the BitLocker issue, that could be a package. We'd have a prompt maybe that says, right, there's an issue with your device. We need to reboot it. We don't need to go into all the detail. There's no need. And then a package that when the operator says, yep, go for it, package that runs, that resumes BitLocker, makes sure it's healthy, and then restarts the machine. And that would be a really typical example of this. But at that point, we've interacted, we've told them we've got a problem, and off we go. And then in a few minutes, the portal would be healthy and we'd be in a good place again.
So I'm guessing as far as the language that we put in the survey, maybe, the old try it now, right? So maybe we put a message in there. Once you click the submit button, please try your access again in 2 minutes, 5 minutes, try again in 5 minutes. And so rather than them, they can go refresh their coffee, but rather than wasting half a day, in traditional legacy processes, now it's literally just a couple minutes.
Exactly that. So actually, one thing to mention, or in fact, probably a couple of things to mention, and these are coming from the article we've written and we're going to publish. I don't want to get too bogged down into the technical, but if you're familiar with max age with Tanium, that comes into play here. So with Zero Trust, what we're effectively doing is checking the state of that sensor on a pretty aggressive basis. But max age, and if you're not familiar with that, max age is a configuration that applies to every sensor within Tanium, and it's settable on each sensor individually, that says if I've executed this sensor within this amount of time, just return the same results. Don't rerun the sensor and get the data back, because if the max age is 10 minutes, and the data hasn't changed, I don't need to recheck it. And you can get different lengths of max age by default. So things like computer name, for argument's sake, don't change very often. So we don't check that very often. So the max age is quite high. Things like IP address would be like that too. Whereas this sensor, we'd want that to have quite a low max age, because we want to be proactive about finding out when the state of that has changed quite quickly. So if you are using some of the out-of-the-box sensors and you're seeing things not react as quickly as you would like within Zero Trust, just check the max age. What we would always advise, I certainly would, and I'm pretty certain Ashley would as well, if it is an out-of-the-box sensor that we provide, copy it and make a change to the copy, because we're proactive about fixing things, updating things. So if we come along with some fixes or enhancements to that sensor, we're going to go and overwrite that max age change that you might make. So that's something just to be aware of. So for instance, if the sensor has a max age of an hour and you want it to be 5 minutes, just copy it, change it to 5 minutes, and use your copied sensor within the Zero Trust rule and the DEX logic as well. And then the other thing that I was going to say, and I think I've said it probably 10 times in the last hour, check before enforce. So use the report only option within conditional access within Entra ID. If you are changing the attribute within Tanium that's going up to Entra ID and you're already using that as part of something else, you might want to use the audit rather than the enforce option within Zero Trust then as well, just to make sure that you're not going to send a big change up that's not expected. So again, just being careful.
So there's a safety switch on both sides, on the Tanium
Exactly.
side and the Azure side. So you've
Yeah,
got the report only in Azure, and then the audit mode here, which report only is audit mode, right? So you've got an
exactly
audit
that. Yeah, just
method on
different
both
language.
sides. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good safety. And again, probably another troubleshooting tip. If like, hey, why is it not actually
Yeah.
doing
And
anything?
you've
Just
got
yeah.
just to show you, we'll go back there really quickly. We didn't go in here, but we've got the audit log that's showing us where we've applied these attributes. So we can see Win11 Cube 1, MDE health, and then if I go into this, we can see the the criteria that was met, what it did. So in this case, we applied that rule. We can see it applied to this extension attribute, and that was what was written. For instance, we can also see I was doing some testing earlier on. We removed this criteria or that attribute when it no longer met the criteria, so you can see what happened. Um, One other thing that we haven't talked about at all, if you find yourself in a bit of a hole and you need to undo things quickly, there is a manual override. So we can come in and we can forcibly apply the attribute data manually. So if I come into this, we can come in, target based on questions. So it could be all Windows 10 if we need it to, or Windows 11, whatever applies. And then we can specifically say, I want to remove or apply this attribute. So there is an override again if you need that.
So what's that doing exactly?
So that is basically allowing you to force an attribute to be added or removed from Entra ID as if a rule had triggered it.
Ah, which could be helpful for testing as well.
Could be useful for testing. It could also, I think it's really intended for we're in a mess and we need to make a change quickly to react to something. I wouldn't see it as part of a regular workflow. It could be, but I think it's really intended as something unintended has happened and I need to react to it. And this gives me the ability to react quickly.
Very nice. So that's kind of like you set up all your dominoes in a row, and then okay, I'm going to
Then
start
it
at the
just goes,
third
boom.
domino instead of the first one, and kind of fix
Yeah.
things. Okay, yeah, that's a really handy feature. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think that's all I have to show you. It's
Yeah, I think we're
not
good.
a vast amount to it, but it's a really powerful capability.
Rob, this really is a compelling demo. I mean, I'm just thinking about how this really does transform the everyday non-technical user, like you said, from their experience. Hopefully they don't ever have this experience, but on the occasion that they do, it's going to be a much better, faster experience involving less support from IT, getting back to business. So this is really good. I'm curious. I know this has been out for a while. Cloud on-prem, where's this available, when, that kind of thing?
All of the above.
Okay.
So yeah, it's on prem, it's on cloud. I say it's simple to set up. It's easy. It's an outbound connection from the service. So if you're an on-prem customer, that can obviously sometimes be a little bit challenging. If there are things that need an inbound connection to Tanium, they need a little bit more configuring. But no, this is as long as your service can connect out, and that's covered on the docs, the remote endpoints that are needed. It's easy. Off you go.
Which brings me next question. You've obviously worked with this a lot. Are there some places where you notice people stumble, or because it's like you got to get all the dominoes lined up exactly right, or are there particular places you've seen where people make a mistake?
The conditional access policies, and for a variety of reasons. So this, an example I'd give actually, and we ran into this. I'll be totally honest about it. My previous role, think about the different levels of control that you want to apply, and then build those and put your applications into the appropriate levels. We we started, as I think lots of organizations do, with single sign-on, as okay, well, it's a cloud app, we need SSO, off we go. And then before we knew it, we'd got like 15 or 20 different apps, and we'd got a real mismatch of policies. And it was really difficult to understand what policy should apply. We could see what was applying, but from a compliance perspective, that was pretty poor, and we had gaps. So yeah, it wasn't good. It was good um, technology and capability, but how we configured it didn't make sense. So we took a step back and said, right, well, based on all of what we've learned, these are the policies that we want. So we built those policies, and exactly what I was saying earlier in the video about only allowing things quite prescriptively. So we deny unless, and we just retrofitted and went back into that. And we went from easily 10 or 15 policies to I think it was four in the end. And it was far better. And it was, the default was the most restrictive. So you've got to have a compliant device, you've got to use MFA, you can't be coming from a nasty country, that kind of thing. And if anything had a lower level of restriction, it had to be explicitly named and excluded from the more restrictive policy. So it was good from that perspective. It was that's probably one of the big things I'd say. And going alongside that, as we said earlier, be really careful with your policies when you're implementing them. Use that report only option. We all know we're all being asked to do more, quicker, with less, safer, etc. It's sort of one of the pick two out of three options there. Report only is really effective of telling you quite quickly if you've made a really big mistake. That and testing. So I've had a personal Azure tenant for years. I think it's kind of the equivalent of labs that we all used to have, and well, I still do. But the ability to go and fiddle with that stuff. So a tenant and a few licenses isn't expensive, and it's something that every employer I've ever worked for will provide. And it allows you to go and experiment with this stuff safely, because testing in production is it's something that will catch you out one day in a bad way.
Yeah, we used to call that a Reggie, a resume generating event.
Yep.
Yeah, you don't be Reggie.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess it's probably we should have said this up front, right? But this is just the technical implementation piece, which
Yeah.
follows your policy design that you just talked about and your governance.
Yeah.
Those big those words that most of us dread because it means a lot of meetings usually. But we
It
really do
does,
want to be
but
intentional about our
yes,
policies and our design to avoid some of that, all that havoc of all those
yeah.
policies and not sure of why did they get this block, right? So having that proper design up front really is key.
I mean, I found working with our CISO and his team was the right way to go. You know, we went and said, look, this is the concern we've got. We think it's got too complicated and we can't manage it effectively. And we're concerned that we're going to get gaps. So this is what we are generally seeing, and this is what we think we should configure. But we went to them and said, look, these are all the options, and this is how we think we should do it. But what do you think? Because you've got a big stake in this conversation as well as I do. So how would you approach this? And that was a really positive conversation. It wasn't lots and long drawn out meetings or anything. It was, they liked what we proposed, a few changes, and then we got on with implementing it. And in sort of IT ops, where you end up wearing 15 different hats and you haven't even got to lunchtime, you're often concerned about, I do something and I've been asked to do it and I get blamed for it, but it's not that it's gone wrong, it's implemented as it wants to be, but it's upset people. But if you've got the backing of the wider organization, then actually they'll support you in those scenarios.
Well, Rob, I'd like to thank you for joining us again. I have a feeling that this is going to be another popular hit video for you. Your last ones did so well. So thank you for joining us on the show again today. And as usual, folks, we have links in the docs and resources in the show notes today. And depending on when you're watching this video, we know that there's some doc links there, but we're almost ready to release another walkthrough article over in the resource center at help.tanium.com. So when that's available, it'll be linked there. But for sure, the docs that you saw in the video are there. So we've got those resources for you. So now let's go get users back on the network faster, back into their apps faster with this integration with Tanium and Microsoft. So until next time, go Tanium.